pomeriggio a tutti.
Good afternoon, everybody. We will start our meeting by reading information given to us by the organizers. So you are kindly requested to communicate the Secretariat whether you want to participate in the trip to Bevagna on Sunday afternoon, 16th of April, as you can read in the agenda of the settimana.
The Bevagna trip on Sunday afternoon, 16 April, as scheduled in the program of the conference. Thank you. Altro avviso.
Another piece of information for you. We inform you that the elections of tomorrow, 15th of April, the lectures of tomorrow, Saturday, will start at 9:45 with the following agenda. 9:45 lecture by Professor Barthelemy, 10:45 lecture by Professor Montanari.
Of Saturday, 15 April, will begin at 9:45 antemeridiem with the following schedule: 9:45 antemeridiem, Barthelemy lecture; 10:45 antemeridiem, Montanari lecture. Omnia in mensura ordine, mensura numero et ordine disposuisti. Allora diamo subito inizio.
So we can start with the lecture by a professor who has a wonderful last name, because his last name is LICHT, so light, if I'm not wrong. Certum solatium tempore incerto. You have the floor. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'd like to highlight the importance of simultaneous translation. So I'd like to thank the interpreters. Interpreters say thank you. So interpretation makes mutual understanding possible. So for this presentation, you need the abstract, which I gave to the Secretariat, so that you can follow me. And there is a little mistake, so maybe this is due to Gerberto Rhymes in the title. You can see the year 1011 02, but he died in 1003, so 1003. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, the topic of my lecture is Certum solatium tempore incerto, time and zeitgeist in a Gerbert of rhymes. I can say that there are no explicit reflections on the subject of time in Gerbert's work. Taking a theologically independent stance on time, as you know, had become difficult since late antiquity anyway. The subject of time is a subject that has always used the same reference text. In Book 11 of the Confessiones, Augustine set down his thoughts on God and time. These reflections have often been taken out and handed down separately. In the Excepta ex operibus Augustini, a collection of the most important Augustinian passages in the size of a codex, which Eugippius, the abbot of San Severino in Castellum Lucullanum near Naples, compiled in the 6th century, the 9th paragraph is dedicated to this reflection on time. Eugippius also gives the essence of Augustine's thoughts in the heading, and I quote. So, text number 1. De tempore, quod cum homo meteri videatur, non tamen potes comprehendere, quid sit tempus. On time, which, though man thinks he can measure it, he cannot understand what time is. We may take this as a warning in dealing with time. For Augustine, measuring time is a substitute action. True time is the time of the soul, and it lies with God. Just like time, the word Zeitgeist, spirit of time, is also treacherous. I don't know whether there is an Italian equivalent for Zeitgeist. In Latin, it is perhaps genius seculi, a binon, which only existed in the 17th century. German literature knows a famous warning against the Zeitgeist and the hope of being able to trace it. So this warning is expressed in the scene of Goethe's Faust, in which the literate pupil Wagner spreads his naive thirst for knowledge before the admired scholar Faust. Faust, who has long replicated in a semi-ironic tone, becomes almost angry. Text number 2 in the abstract on the slide. My friend, the times of the past are a book with 7 seals to us. What you call the spirit of the times, that is fundamentally the Lord's own spirit, in which the times are reflected. The warning is clear. Faust asserts that the genius seculi cannot be restored. He raises the not unjustified objection that man can only approach the past in time-bound forms of thought, and in doing so, force into hidden patterns in such a way that he compares them in the old times. Medieval Latin philology, which is my subject of study, counters this objection with the methodical approach. It certainly does not do this alone, but in a programmatic way. Since our founder, the Munich philologist Ludwig Traube, we have regarded the manuscript as the direct evidence of historical language, writing, and literature. Traube's most famous words on this are number 3 on the slide and your abstract. Even the copying of any author's text is a small historical fact, or that these and every subsequent scribe acts on his own intentionally or unconsciously, his mistakes and improvements, his marginal notes, down to the simplest avis, simplest opinion, to the lecture, the sign for note and requires the pointing end. All these short, almost silent hints and signs can be interpreted as historical testimonies. End of quote. So, in other words, the reservoir of a philology working in the field of cultural history lies in the written testimony. The uncertainty in the face of historical distance is countered by the validity of the medieval manuscript. Today, one would more generally say the medieval script-bearing artifact. Those who know how to question it correctly can establish an immediacy to its object that is denied to other disciplines. The oldest manuscript of the complete works of Horace, for example, written in the 2nd quarter of the 9th century in the Alsatian monastery of Weidenwerk, says something about the Carolingian reception of Horace, but beyond the text, it says nothing about Horace's impact during his lifetime. The distance of almost 900 years is too great. For the Latin of the Middle Ages, on the other hand, it is true that we can get to the exponents of the time, including Gerbert of Rhymes, through contemporary manuscripts. The aim of this lecture is to get closer to the time and the spirit of Gerbert of Rhymes, primarily through manuscripts. The fact that this is possible is due to the preservation of an imperial library in Bamberg, in Germany. There, once the cathedral library, and later the electoral library, and now the state library, we find the old imperial library, which goes back to Otto III and was given to the Bamberg Cathedral by Henry II. Not fully preserved, but still in such a way that we have exceptional access to the literature of the ruling dynasty and the scholars associated with it. Perhaps you can object that we already know the imperial libraries from Charlemagne or Louis the Pious, but the decisive difference lies in the tradition. Everything that the Carolingians were able to gather around them for their reign was scattered after their death, either immediately or in the next generation, and can at best be gathered together through research. In Bamberg, you don't have to do that. We look into the bookcase of the German Imperial House. There you will find outstanding manuscripts. I will only mention as an example a manuscript of the 6th century, which for the first time unites and harmonizes the Christian literary history of Jerome and Gennadius in one codex, together with Augustine's supplement De Eresibus, that is the writers with dissenting doctrine. The manuscript was produced in Castellum Lucullanum near Naples at the time when Eugippius, just introduced as Augustine's epitometer, was abbot and exponent of patristic studies. And it was also the owner of a scriptorium in which the semi-uncial was cultivated to a calligraphic level never again attained. Well, we are talking about the calligraphy of Castellum Lucullanum in this period, and here you can see the quote. De Viris Illustribus by Jerome, by Gennadius, but the list of the individual parts is comes next, so a harmonized version, we might say. The examples could be multiplied with Levis manuscripts from the 5th century or Cassiodorus Institutiones from Monte Cassino, written in the 8th century. But this is in Bamberg, but our subject today is Gerbert of Rhymes. He came from Aquitaine, studied in northern Spain, came in contact with Otto II in Italy, where he spent unhappy years as abbot of Bobbio. Then he became teacher, later on Archbishop of Rheims, and finally Pope as Sylvester II. You can find a short biography on your sheet number 5. Thanks to the Bamberg Library, we can draw up a detailed profile of Gerbert. This is not because he writes about himself in more details, but because there is one of his students who left behind a historiographical work, the chances of being handed down of which would have been rather close to zero under other circumstances. His name is Richard of Saint-Denis, so a short biography is on sheet number 6. He's Gerbert's pupil, and following the old annals, reports on the history of the archbishops of Rheims in a work that is perhaps best described as a regional chronicle. This work has not been able to develop a manuscript tradition. All that has survived is the reader's concept, notes, some of which have been rewritten and reworded. We gain a unique insight into the genesis of historiographical work on the basis of a notarial codex, a real concept. You can see this in Bamberg. So you can also see the character of this calligraphy with several inserta, so with pages included with some connections, and so there was an intense work on a text, and this manuscript is referred to as conceptus. That this codex has been preserved, we owe to Gerbert, his relations with the Ottonian Imperial House, and above all Bamberg. We are given the opportunity to be introduced to Gerbert's teaching in rhymes in detail. The passage is too long to read, to be read out here. Number 8 of your dossier. Gerbert reads quite unusual or little handed-down works. For example, the categories of Aristotle, the Esagoge of Porphyrius, the Peri-Hermeneias by Aristotle, the works De Arithmetica and De Musica. So at this point, I can stop, because maybe you have already noticed these are works by Boëtius. They are, like the Arithmetica and the Music, from his pen, or are, as in the case of the Esagoge or the Peri-Hermeneias, translation of Boëtius. Gerbert of Rhymes is the first great exponent of the reception of Boëtius in the Middle Ages. I must emphasize this fact specifically. Of course, there were also Boëtius connoisseurs before that. However, it is exceptional that someone should make Boëtius guidelines insofar as they come into his hands, the basis of a comprehensive education at Cathedral School. We find this for the first time in Gerbert. In 980, the son of Otto II and Theophanu, later Otto III, was born. Otto III was 17 years old when he wrote a letter to Gerbert asking him to join him permanently as a teacher. Text number 9 on the handouts. What is unusual about this letter are not the concluding verses, which have something unscholarly about them and for this reason seem authentic. Versus nuncom composvi, nec in studio abui, cum in uso abuero, et in eis viguero, quod tabet virus Gallia tot vobis mittam carmina. Otto III writes, "It is extraordinary that Otto tries to awaken in himself the wisdom of the Greeks, because Otto III, as the son of Theophanu, is half Greek, by asking him to mediate in arithmetic." I quote text number 9. Ut Grecorum vivax ingenium Deo adiutore, suscitatis et nos arithmeticae librum edo cetis, ut pleniter eius instructi documentis, aliquid priorum intelligamus subtilitatis. That translation, that you may awaken the eager talent of the Greeks with God's help in us, and teach us the book of arithmetic, so that we, richly instructed by the contents of the book, may absorb something of the greatness of our ancestors. End of the translation. Gerbert writes back to Otto III, pledging his services as a teacher and explaining why he considers arithmetic a key discipline. Text number 10 on your handout. Nisi ad infirmum teneritis ad fixum, vim numerorum vel, in se omnium derum continere primordia, vel ex sese profundere, non ad eurum plenam perfectamque noticiam tanto festinetis studio. Translation. For if you do not keep firmly and clearly in mind that it is the nature of numbers to contain within themselves the primordial foundations of all things, and to develop them out of themselves, you will not quickly and eagerly attain to their full and complete knowledge. End of the translation. In se continere primordia vel ex esse profundere. This is the essence of the number. So, for Gerbert, the number is the key to the world. And Gerbert teaches this arithmetic on the basis of, through Boëtius. So this is not explicitly stated by LICHT, but that is what the Bamberg tradition suggests. For it is clear, Classicus 5, 6, 7, and 8 of the Bamberg State Library contain Boëtius de Arithmetica. All these manuscripts once belonged to the Cathedral Library. All these manuscripts were written before year 1000, and most of them come from Eastern France or Lorraine. Among them is a volume that you can see here, which was described as the most beautiful mathematics book of the Middle Ages. It is a magnificently illuminated book, partly written in gold ink, the dedication picture of which Boëtius presents Caesar de Arithmetica to his father-in-law Symmachus, you have surely seen depicted before. The inscribed dedications would fit Otto III splendidly, because the poem begins, text number 11, with Pitagora licet parvo Capedona libello invicto pollent nomine Caesar avi. Translated, take the Pythagorean gifts, even if they come in the little book, emperor who bears the name of the grandfather, Otto. End of translation. But we can be quite sure that the book was dedicated to a Carolingian emperor, for the volume dates from the second third of the 9th century and was written in Tours. And it probably became an imperial gift a second time when Otto III received it. So the question is, did Gerbert take care of the book? Could it perhaps be that the marginalia found in it came from him? I'd like to go back to this image. You see it's the same book, so a manuscript of Tours, half of the 9th century. You can see a page of the text taken from this manuscript. As you can see, this is the main scripture, but then the edges are a bit cut. So there are several notes. Maybe they are reflections by Gerbert here on the edge. It might be autograph. Well, the issue concerns a paleographic key, namely that of Gerbert's autograph. It would be instructive if we could trace Gerbert's mediation in teaching through notes. Unfortunately, despite a long research discussion on the autograph, I cannot give you good news. The investigations into Gerbert's writing habits have too often not been confirmed. For the time being, all we know for sure is that Gerbert mastered shorthand in a distinctive system. This is the so-called syllabic tachygraphy. In this system, a syllable is made of 2 or at most 3 characters, and it differs systematically from the Teronic notes known from the Carolingian times. Gerbert left such syllabic tachygraphy in the Bamberg manuscripts in 2 points. So he recalled attention to these, and Hartmut Hoffmann drew attention to these passages. There are very few notes which do not help much in tracing the rhymes teacher. Here you can see all the tachygraphic notes, a kind of stenography by Gerbert. You can see 2 examples from Bamberg, and here, so Apis Pauperis and Mediatrice, so a combination of syllables from the tachygraphic notes. So a syllabic tachygraphy in Italian way. But rather than this marginal note from classical 5, well, this is very important. So the stenographic note I showed cannot come from Gerbert because there is no tachygraphic system in it, but the teronic system. The pertonica sentenza is a teronic note. In the case of the alphabet script, so not the stenographic notes of Gerbert, there is just one serious candidate for an autograph of Gerbert of rhymes. Pasquale Arfè assigned Gerbert a schematic representation on the flyleaf of a Brussels manuscript which belonged to the library of Nicola Cusano. In we can say something very specific for Gerbert. We know from Literature of Saint Remy that once Gerbert, in a public dispute, had to defend this doctrine. His opponent, a man named Hautrich of Magdeburg, accused him of a systematic error in a presentation of physics, according to which Gerbert once regarded physics as equal to mathematics and once regarded physics as superior. Gerbert defends himself by distinguishing between two types of physics, namely a general physics in which mathematics is subordinate, and a physics of bodies, so physiology, which is at the same level of mathematics. It is understandable that Richter describes this the dispute, which is said to have taken place in Ravenna in 981, as a triumph of Gerbert. So it is interesting for us that Gerbert's systematic separation of physics and physiology can be recognized in the diagram of the manuscript of Brussels Bibliothèque Royale. The writings that appears in it is distinctive and benefits the hand of a scholar, and it is noticeable that the scribe does not use the ST ligature. Unfortunately, Arfè succumbed to the temptation to attribute to the end of the manuscript to Gerbert as well. A comparison of the scripts would have shown that the use of the script does not fit Gerbert because there are two different scribes that use the ligature between S and T. If we suppose that Arfè's observation is correct, one thing becomes clear. That is, all the notes discussed so far as Gerbert's autograph in Erlangen or Baalbek manuscripts and are not in shorthand are not by him. In particular, the so-called alpha hand, which is presented in the Clavis Gerbertiana as his autograph, bears no resemblance to the hand that Arfè correctly identified. Proof of the Clavis Gerbertiana on number 14. So a few words about this. You see, there is a specific division in 13 subdisciplines, and then physiology with mathesis, theology. They are all at the same level, and the typically Gerbertian approach, I believe that Arfè's observation is correct. Here on the right demonstratio, we see that Gerbert didn't use the ligature between S and T. What can we learn about Gerbert's arithmetic lessons if he did not reflect on them autographically? The tradition of Boëtius de Arithmetica has preserved something of these, not autograph, but still connected with Gerbert's name. At least 14 manuscripts of De Arithmetica transmit a small arithmetical note, which has become known as Saltus Gerberti, and which is one of Gerbert's authentic works. In it, Gerbert devotes himself to the numerical ratios sesqualter, sesquitertius, and sesquiquartus. So the ratios of the numbers between 1 and 1.5, 1 and 1 1/3, 1/4, or expressed after Boëtius, sed squalter habet totum minorem et minoris medietatem, sisqui tertius habet totum minorem et tertiam partem, sisqui quartus habet totum minorem et quartam partem. A combination of three numbers in the ratio of 1 and 1/4, that is 3 sesquiquarti, through a formula so to decompose this formula into their corresponding ratios in such a way that 3 equalis remain at the end was a task Gerbert set himself, and the solution of which he presents in the Saltus Gerberti. His conclusion is important for our purposes, but I do not want to deprive you of the solution. Put into a modern formula, the derivation would be A apostrophe B apostrophe C apostrophe equal A B minus A C minus A minus 2B apostrophe. After the first step, the numbers must be rearranged once, then a calculation can be repeated identically until the basic number is reached. Examples for the numbers are 16, 20, 25, and so in this case, there is the sesquiquartus ratio, so the ratio between 16, 20 is 1 1/4, sesquiquartus. So we have the sequence 16 for 1. This sequence is rearranged once to obtain from right to left 1 4 16, 139, 139, 124, 124, and so we have these three equals. Of course, it is also possible to extrapolate these sesquiquarti from the basic numbers. For 2, the series is 2 4 8, 2 16, 2 8 32, and then inverted 32 8 2, who then have the sesquiquarti in 32 40 50. The arithmetical relations behind this are usually described as trivial, but for Gerbert they were a key to the nature of numbers. Text number 15, and I quote: Vide sigitur quem ad modum tota quantita sesquiquarti redacta est ad tres equalis terminos, id est unitates, unus non confuse sed ordinatim, sicut fuerat a principio procreata. Haec est igitur vera natura numerorum. Translation: You see then how the whole circumference of the sesquiquartus has been reduced to three equal numbers, that is, the unit numbers 1 1 1, not confusing but orderly, just as it was created from the beginning. This then is the proper nature of numbers. Gerbert himself once testified to his penetration of the world and time by means of numbers. His letter 153 on the relationship between the hours of day and night has become famous and is often handed down. The calculation of these hours does not follow the traditional Roman system in which each winter day and each summer day has 12 day and 12 night hours, which are then long or short, depending on the month, but is based on an even division of the day into 24 hours and separates the number of light hours from the number of dark hours depending on the month. This is our system. Gerbert gives a shift in the ratio of day and night between the two solstices. In the first month, the ratio shifts by 1/12, in the second by 2/12, in the third by 3/12, in the fourth by 3/12, in the fifth by 2/12, in the sixth by 1/12. Immediately north of the Alps, there is a ratio of 18:6 at the solstice, and from this, in the next month, 17 7 hours, then 15 9 12 12, 9 15, 7 17, 6 18. We're talking about hours. Gerbert also knows that depending on the celestial line, the so-called klima, the ratio of the light and dark hours at solstice is not the same. In Constantinople, he has to use a different ratio for the solstice, namely a ratio of 15:7. The corresponding shifts are arithmetically more demanding because a 1/12 in Constantinople is only half an hour. However, Gerbert's universal approach is also important here. The arithmetical key for calculating the day and night hours, which is always the same, text number 16. Hoc autem idiom feci ut sub omni climate adorum exemplar propria orologia componere possis cum annueris quantitatem solstitialum dierum ex clepsidris. Translation. But I have done this in order that you may be able to compile your own hour tables in every celestial region according to the example of the tables, as soon as you have found out by means of water clocks in what proportion day and night stand at solstice. But it is important to show this. The manuscript for the northern part of the Alps, so the ratio 18:6, the solstice, and we read item orologium lesponti, and so a table of time which should apply to Constantinople. We see a sign that we cannot immediately identify, so half hour, and the graphical sign which reproduces the half hour. I don't know if you can recognize it on the slide. It is indicated in the modern edition. But what does this penchant for arithmetical playfulness have to do with our theme, time, and zeitgeist in Gerbert of Rhymes? The Elogium Boethius should provide an answer to this question. It is one of the poems certainly assigned to Gerbert. The authoritative edition by Karl Strecker in the Poete of the does not take into account the now known oldest manuscript in Paris from the beginning of the 11th century. This is not relevant for the constitution of the text. The Gerbert's poem is divided into two parts: a praise of Boethius and his erudition, which was not inferior to that of the Greeks. Then, however, in the surprising second part, the reinstatement, the restitution of Boethius by Otto III is announced. So you see in your text number 17 the concluding verses. Nunc decus imperi summas qui pregrava tardes, tertius octus suadignum te judicat aula, eternumque tui statuit monumenta laboris, et bene promeritum meritis exornat honestis.
And the translation, but now Otto III, the ornament of the realm, who especially esteems the highest arts, probably the quadrivium, holds you worthy of your court, his court, and Boethius forever builds monuments to your labors and adorns the meritorious with sincere honors. That's the end of the translation. Some of these words might sound typical, but the basic ideas is nevertheless outrageous. Otto III instigates a renaissance of ancient scholarship, and it does so by giving Boethius a top place at his court. And the artes summae, the scholarship of the Greeks, is restored through Boethius to a level that it had reached before the Gothic period and the judicial murder of him. Nor Greek or Latin theologians, but the artists in the tradition of Boethius are the key disciplines of the translation study at the turn of the millennium. So to summarize, the tradition surrounding Gerbert of Reims, which is preserved in particular in the Imperial Library in Bamberg, Germany, offers opportunities for philological work close to the author. The most important basis is the original chronicle of Richer of Saint-Remy, which has been preserved in concept and would hardly have been handed down without Gerbert's work or the Bamberg tradition. According to Richer, Gerbert's teaching in Reims had a mathematical emphasis. It was this penchant for the quadrivium that led Otto III to appoint Gerbert as a teacher. The 4 early manuscripts with the Arithmetica by Boethius, which belong to the Imperial Library, are very probably a reflex of Gerbert's teaching activities for Otto III. Among them is the most magnificent mathematics textbook of the early Middle Ages, which was produced in Tours in the middle of the 9th century and illustrated for a Carolingian emperor, later probably serving as an imperial gift for Otto III. The autograph research on Gerbert of Reims was not completed. All we know for sure is that he uses a syllabic tachygraphic system. His alphabet seems to have been attested only once in a Brussels manuscript. Even if this hope of being able to trace Gerbert's teaching activity through the autograph is not confirmed, traces of Gerbert's teaching have been nevertheless preserved. Exemplary for his teaching of arithmetic is the Saltus Gerberti, exemplary for his arithmetical penetration of time in his Orologium sub omni climate, which is a treatise that had survived several times separately, although it is now only addressed as letter 153 and mentioned as such. Omnia mensura et numero et pondere disposuisti. The quotation from Sapienza 11:21 is, as the famous illustration of the early 13th century indicates, a leitmotif of exact science in the High Middle Ages. Gerbert may be cited as an exponent of this attitude already for the time around the year 1000. The attitude is based on Boethius as a reference author. In the Arithmetica, one could read a variant of Sapienza 11:12. Text under number 18, omnia quecunque a primera rerum natura constructa sunt, numerorum uidentur ratione formata, hoc enim fuit principale in animo conditoris exemplar. Translation: everything that is based on the primordial nature of things has evidently been formed according to numbers, for this was the original plan in the mind of the Creator. End of the translation. So the time around the year 1000 grasps a spirit of exactitude through arithmetics. This is also recognizable beyond Gerbert. We see it when Hermanus Contractus, for example, recalculates the synodic lunar month down to the smallest particles. We see it when in the 11th century, the Spear Cathedral at the equinox on the 20th of March and 20th of September, and only then, the light of the rising sun falls through the apse windows into the nave as far as the main portal. In the 11th century, the arithmeticians were asked for their opinion, according to a manuscript in Montpellier, DÍAZ to Gerbetista. Gerbert was also the first to demonstrate and describe arithmetic with the abacus. He thus triggered a wave of abacus treatises, and his deed was honored in verse. Gelbertus Lazio numero abacique figuras. Gelbert then brought the numbers and figures of the abacus to the Latin world. It stood at the beginning of an etas boethiana, or to answer the initial question about the spirit of time, at the beginning of Saeculum Boethianum. Thank you for your attention.
Wie im Heidelberg Universität wir sagen,
the living spirit, as the University of Bamberg would say, is a Weltanschauung. It's a concept of the world that is present in Heidelberg. With this wide documentation, and especially because it stays in time in mensura numera et pondere. Now we move to the two other lectures that will be delivered one after the other, and another theme, that is time in society and in institutions. These two lectures will be delivered in the language by Dante Alighieri. So we shift language. Of course, also the other European languages are equally important. Mr. Enrico Acerbi, are you the expert of maths in ancient Greece? Yes, it was me. My name was Fabio. It was Fabio, maybe. It's Fabio. That's why. But the surname is the same. So I would like to invite Professor Acerbi to deliver this lecture as expected. Time in Byzantium. That's why I was getting confused. Very well. Good afternoon, everybody. I will speak in Italian, maybe.
Nel tempo, l'eredità scientifica
Over time, the Greek scientific legacy moved to Byzantium, in particular the shadow of Ptolemy, majestueuse et souriante bonne, s'avançant dans les siècles, voyait, sur la lente marche de ses pieds, rouler le monde. In Ptolemy's shadow, the two classical sides developed of chronological reflection and systematization, the broad outlines of which I would like to expose to you, the astronomical chronological tables, which are normally presented together, and the small chronological encyclopedias commonly referred to as the Eastern Computus. The Computus and much of the chronological tables are not Ptolemaic originals, but the result of late, antique, or early Byzantine elaborations. For this reason, they are the subject of my talk today. Early medieval Byzantine elaborations are transmitted in annotated manuscript copies and assume an unconditional and sometimes blind adherence to the Ptolemaic epistemic and expository model. In my perspective today, it is crucial that manuscripts with astronomical or chronological content are often datable. In fortunate cases, it is possible to trace back their history and sometimes trace their temporal roots. Chronology is based on two polar oppositions: dialectic between linear and circular time, so evident first in the periodicity of certain natural phenomena, and dialectic between temporal continuity and calendrical discretization, the latter induced by the periodicities that I've just mentioned. Both oppositions result in a reduction of the first pole to the second, propelled by two powerful technical apparatuses, mathematical astronomy and Eastern computations. The foundational epistemological choice of Ptolemy and of anyone who has since contemplated nature with mathematical eyes, gave numerical form to the underlying regularities of phenomena, and not to their phenomenal complexity. The latter is a possible option, as the ephemerides show. Given the mathematical tools then available, the aforementioned regularity is reduced to the periodicity of the uniform circular motions that characterize the Ptolemaic models, made explicit through the first analog calculator, numerical tables. But natural periods immersed in the continuity of temporal flow are, in principle, incompatible with the calendrical discretization of time units, such as years, months, and days. It follows that the only exact temporal cyclicities are those artificially created, usually for the purpose of approximating natural temporal cyclicities. Let us begin with dialectic between linear and cyclic time in Ptolemy's easy tables, as they have been transmitted to us in Byzantine manuscripts. It is evident and well known that these easy tables do not correspond exactly to those described by Ptolemy. In particular, the chronological tables that are part of them have been modified by accretion and extension. Linear time finds expression in Canon Regius and the Consular Fasti. The Canon Regius sets out the era used by Ptolemy and lists the partial and cumulative durations of regency years in a sequence of dynasties starting from an initial point called the epoch. An underlying calendar structure is obviously needed. The calendar adopted by Ptolemy, and most convenient for astronomical purposes, is composed of vague Egyptian years. For this reason, the starting date of each reign is conventional, coinciding with the beginning of the calendar year in which the change of regency accession year takes place. The eras are attuned by docking them after the other, with the caveat that only eras using the same type of calendar year, vague or Julian or lunar, can be docked. The junction between two eras can occur within a table or involve a change of table, as in the transition from the Nabasar era to the Philip-Aridian era in the easy tables. Within a dynasty, eras can be extended beyond the date of manuscript copying. There are two Canones Regi in the easy tables preserved in Leiden. They are enriched with dated or datable annotations which reveal the layers of this very important manuscript, namely its temporal dimension. The Consular Fasti, that is the list of Roman consuls, have come down to us in two different redactions, attested in two different manuscripts. The first, from AD 138-139 to AD 372-373, eras Philip and Augustus, and two crucial. The first, from AD 222-223 to AD 630-631, of Philip and Augustus, and the indication of Byzantine years and indication. There cannot be a shortage in the chronological encyclopedia worthy of this name, the tables formalizing the dialectic between one's own time and the time of the others. In the easy tables, there are splendid hemerologia. These are tables of concordance between months in different calendars, the year being necessary that of 365 days, but the Julian periodization is implied. The first column obviously contains the calendar of the central province of the empire. In one of such hemerologia, a column appears to which we shall return. In the Leiden manuscript, there is an additional concordance table between the Egyptian, Alexandrinian, Roman, and Antiochian calendars. A table of the same type, but conceived differently, contains annotations on the beginning of the months in the Hebrew and Tyrian year, the length of day and night, and relevant astronomical phenomena taking place on fixed dates. This numerologia, which constitutes a strictly chronological variant of the solar motion tables according to Ptolemaic models, cannot be continued or attached to each other. We have entered the realm of cyclical time. Cyclicality is lost in the monthly calendar unit, but is recovered in the daily calendar unit and, most importantly, in the entirely fictitious periodicity of the week. The determination of the day of the week is complicated by the adoption of the Julian year, characterized by the 4-year leap year period. Since 7 and 4 are prime to each other, and 365 is not a multiple of either of these numbers, the result is a 28-year weekly cycle. The determination of the day of the week is entrusted to two table complexes. The first combines two subtables. From the first one, we get the sequence of letters of the alphabet that corresponds to the current year in a 7-year cycle beginning Anno Mundi 6349, Anno Domini 840-841. From the second one, we get the letter that corresponds to the assigned date. At the head of the row containing this letter in the sequence of the first table is the day of the week of the assigned date. Leap years are taken into account in the algorithm that reduces the current year to that of the 7-year cycle beginning in Anno Mundi 6349. Alternatively, one can use a table indicating the day of the week of an assigned date within the 28-year calendar period. We find it in the Leiden Easy Tables and in a slightly modified form in Anonymous 686. Among the manuscripts of the Easy Tables, these two tables are found only in the Leiden Codex, which is confirmed as the only astronomical and chronological instruction manual. In the Narratio de Pascat in Maximus the Confessor, a variable entry table is used to find the starting day of an assigned month in an assigned year. After reducing the year to the solar cycle, the month is inserted into the table in the center of the wheel, and the solar cycle in the wheel. This part is inserted in the first row of the table in the center of the wheel, and the solar cycle and the cell identified by the value of the epatas and that of the month provides the day of the week. None of the manuscripts of the Easy Tables contain chronological tables that allow us to determine the time, although in the Leiden Easy Tables there's a list of their names. In the Computes, short sections listing 1-hour subdivisions are frequent. For an assigned date, seasonal hours were roughly quantified in oropodia, which indicate hour by hour and month by month the length of the shadow of an object of assigned height, usually 6 feet. The underlying arithmetic structure is very rough. Months are often paired. Maximum lengths differ by 1 unit month by month and depend, of course, on latitude. In a assigned month, the prime differences are 10, 4, 3, 2, 1. The sequence of shadow length is symmetrical with noon as the center. No length is associated with the 12th hour. It is not surprising to find oropodia of circular shape. These tables are sometimes associated with Easter computations and often found in the psalters. Sometimes the names of the months in the Antiochian calendar are used. It is time to introduce a formal interlude. You may have noticed two competing shapes, rectangular and circular boards, the so-called wheels. The latter, nothing more than rectangular boards, two of whose sides are glued together, makes explicit the cyclical character of the variable tabulated. Circular tables are also in use in the strictly astronomical sphere. Once the tabulated phenomena are cyclical, the best-known case is that of the horizon diagram. Between the easy table of Leiden and the Greek Vatican 1291, that's the picture on your right, and it's on the left side. There are two different reductions of a wheel of lunar epatas. This is the accumulated difference, module 30, between the 365 days of the calendar year and the 354 of 12 schematic lunar months, that is of 29.5 days each. The first wheel runs from AD 313-314 to AD 521-522. The second, which must also have been present in the Almagest Vatican week 1594, since we find it in all its epigraphs prior to the mutilation, from AD 314 to 540-541. In both cases, the era of Diocletian is adopted. These two images highlight the flow of the wheels that cannot be fractionated, as can be done for rectangular tables. And for this reason, they become unusable when they must contain too much data. In astronomical tables, cyclicity is automatically guaranteed whenever a dip in higher order tables is realized, as is demonstrated by the identity of values at the end of a lower order table and at the beginning of a higher order table. Semantically, cyclicity is expressed by assigning a name to a basic periodic unit, for example the day, of which higher order periodic units such as the week or the year are made up. It should be noted that none of the tables seen so far are doubly cyclic, that is, they have a toric structure. Obviously, in wheels, a radial cyclicity cannot be implemented. The motion of the moon is more complex than that of the sun. Its representation in chronological tables usually consists of the adaptation to the calendar year of a sequence of schematic lunar months. It is a combination of the cyclical nature of lunar and solar motion. An early example is the selenodrome, also attested among the easy tables as the last column of the Florentine Hemerologium, and more fully and with fewer copying errors in Anonymous 686. The lunar months are immersed one after the other in the calendar year by means of 10 letters of the alphabet, from alpha to K, spaced 2 days apart. The 30 days of the full lunar months thus result covered. 2 letters, spaced by only 1 day, identify the 29-day hollow lunar month. This table is to be used in conjunction with the table of days according to the moon, which takes into account the lunar epatas proper to each cycle. A table of lunar motion that was heavily criticized in the late Byzantine age is that of the course of the moon in zodiac signs as a function of the Roman or Alexandrian month. It is omnipresent in the easy tables and also attested in Anonymous 686. The motion of the moon makes us converge on the Easter computations, which are already integrated with astronomical and chronological material in Stephen Reclius' commentary on the easy tables. The Eastern computations are actually small chronological encyclopedias in which algorithms are provided for the reduction of years in an era assigned to the circumstantial solar and lunar cycles, and algorithms for calculating legal and Christian Easter, as well as related holidays such as Carnival or the length of the Apostles' Fast, in addition to general chronological data such as temporal subdivisions. Sporadically, the computers are enriched with astrological material or folklore pertaining to natural philosophy, origin of winds, beginning of the seasons. Eastern computations can be an integral part of many textual constellations. A computo can be a treaty immersed in a discursive and doctrinal framework, such as the Narratio of Maximus the Confessor and the Computo of Giorgio Presbyterus. A computo may be an addition to a larger or more articulated treaty, such as Anonymous 686, which we already know, and which completes Maximus' Narratio, among others, in the Leiden Universitätsbibliothek 33 of the 11th century. A computus may be an addition and an instruction manual to Easter tables, such as Nicholas 916, which has the form of a letter, in the 10th century manuscripts, Hamburger Staats- und Universitätsbibliothek in 58, and London British Library in edition 18231, and Theophylactus 956 in the Hamburg manuscript. A computo may be part of a florilegium, such as a computistic section of the Florilegium Coesilianum, for example, in Ambrose 74 Sup, late of the 10th century, and in the Greek paragraph 924 of the 10th century. An algorithm, the computistic section of the Florilegium is dated AD 716. A computer may be part of the material accompanying a psalter, like Anonymous 952 in Oxford Bodleian Library, Auctus D41, ending with a mutilated Pascalion, dated Anno Mundi 645964, that is Anno Domini 956. The computation can be part of an instruction manual to a collection of astronomical tables, such as the algorithms contained in sections 12 and 28-30 of the Stephen Racklion's commentary on the Easy Tables. The computation can be a part of an ontology, whether this is a folio for personal use, such as the Perugino Greek supplement 920, which contains Anonymous 892, a collection with a more sustained tone, such as Ambrosiano A45 Sup, in which there are excerpts from an Alexandrian computation and Anonymous 830, or an anthology of a high formal level, such as Perugino Greek supplement 690, 1075, 1085. The Eastern computations formalize the best-known entirely artificial attempt to cage linear temporality in cyclical structures. In modern terms, the Byzantine computers reduced the sequence of positive integers of the Byzantine world era to the following. Form 15. This is the indiction cycle introduced for fiscal reasons in AD 3123. The presence of indiction reduction algorithms in the Byzantine computers shows by itself that they were designed as chronological encyclopedias. Module 19 is the lunar cycle, which is the best approximation of the cycle, resulting from the immersion of a schematic lunar month in the Julian calendar year. This cycle should be more properly be called the lunisolar, as the synodic month goes from conjunction to conjunction. Module 28 is the 28-year solar calendar cycle, results from the combination of the Julian leap year and weekly periodicity. The reduction of Module 19 of a number such as, for example, 6,428 consists of taking the remainder of the division of 6,428 by 19. This remainder, in our case 6, is the year of the lunar cycle. The same procedure applies in the other two cases. The result is that the indictional cycle lasts 15 years, the lunar cycle 19, and the Julian calendrical cycle 28. The date of Easter is tied to the so-called legal Easter, which formalizes, that is, submits to the algorithm the Jewish Easter, setting it on the 14th day that in the schematic lunar month falls no earlier than the spring equinox, the date of which is set at March 21. Each year, in a 19-year lunar cycle, is associated with a legal Easter date. The sequence of dates repeats identically in each cycle. Since the lunar month occupies 30 days, the reduction of astronomical time to ecclesiastical time generates temporal topology with not all dates between March 21st and April 19 accommodate a legal Easter. An isomorphic sequence, that of the dates of the legal Easter from which this is calculated, is that of the lunar epatas, which is the accumulated difference, module 30, between the 365 days of the calendar year and the 354 of 12 schematic lunar months. As we have seen, between the easy tables of Leiden and Greek Vatican 1291, there are two different reductions of a wheel of the lunar epatas. The Christian Easter falls on the first Sunday following the legal Easter. The Easter cycle thus combines the lunar cycle and the Julian calendar cycle. Since 19 and 28 are prime to each other, the Easter cycle lasts 28 by 19, that is 532 years, the Julian one, of course. Its artificial character is confirmed by the fact that a table representing this double periodicity as a toric structure. I have not been able to trace this toric figure in any early medieval manuscript. The 13th cycle of 532 years, AD 877-1408, is represented in its entirety in two manuscripts. The table contains years in the eras Anno Mundi, Anno Domini, and solar cycle, leap cycle, lunar cycle, lunar cycles, date of legal Easter and the date of the week in which it falls, date of Easter, indiction, and date of Carnival Sunday. The 532-year cycle is conveniently comprised in the so-called Damascene table, as in the case of the ball. I have not been able to trace it in the early medieval manuscripts.
An intermediate genre between computistic algorithms and tables, such as the Damascene one or the Paschalia, which bring together elements pertinent to the dating of the calendrical year with ecclesiastical calendar staples that coincide with those calculated in the computi year in the era Anno Mundi, 11 solar and lunar cycles, Carnival, date of legal Easter, and date of week on which it falls, date of Easter. The Paschalia are omnipresent in the manuscripts, are very often disconnected from other computational material, and are strongly connoted iconographically. It's time to conclude. As mentioned at the beginning, manuscripts bearing chronological tables or computus are often enriched with dated annotations. Some of the constituent elements of the computus are by their very nature dated, so are the examples accompanying the algorithms, so necessarily are the Paschalia. If even the date Anno Mundi is not given, since 15, 19, 28 are first among them, providing indication lunar cycle and lunar cycle is sufficient to identify a date in an interval of 28 times 19 times 15, 7,980 years, a cycle within which we still find ourselves. In cases such as the Leiden East tables, the manuscript is a distinctly time-projected object. There are manuscript annotations and interventions dated 521, 578, 610, 615, 16, 630, 775, 76, 708, 81, 783, 84, 797, 98, 798, 99, 811, 12, 813, 840, 41, 913, 1084, 85, 1258, 1020, 1286, 102, 1290, 1292, 1298, 1302, 1346, 46, 1404, 1419, 1420, and again the Viridocti used the manuscript after Gallus acquired it in Constantinople between 1625 and 1629, Schmidt in 1647, and then Hermann Husner and Wilhelm Kubitschek several times between 1871 and 1913, Alfred Cordoliani in 1948, and finally Adolf Rohm in 1954. This fact reminds us of the need to describe manuscripts as historical objects. C'est là d'utile les faire assembler à des êtres monstrueux, jouisseurs des vivantes et chasses, comme occupant place prolongée, sans mesure, puisqu'ils touchent simultanément comme des géants plongés dans les années, à des époques entre lesquelles tant de jours sont venus se placer dans le temps.
Mirabile precisione di dati.
Fantastic precision of data. The richness of documentation is something super. So, thank you. Our conference will keep the memory of this precise data. So now we have a 15-minute break and we resume at 5 p.m. with the last lecture that will take us to Cluny, if I'm not wrong. As of now, we're still here. So see you in 15 minutes. Take care. Adios.
in Spagna. E lo studio del così si fa.
Si fa così.
Sa, questo è per la messa, il Santis della messa.
Si faceva così. Io sono andato l'aiutante del prete quando ero bambino.
Certo, sì.
Posso mettermi in fin dopo, tanto devo venire dopo.
Sì. Ma sì. Poi chiamiamo anche
Poi mi viene. Che lasciato il suo sacco qui. Il suo sacco è lì.
di lui. Sì. Possiamo dare inizio all'ultima lezione.
So we can now start the last lecture before the discussion, which will deal the discussion about the individual lectures. So now we will have the lecture by Professor DÍAZ from the University of Salamanca. And I read the title, The Time of the Monastery Before Cluny. Thank you. I'd like to thank Cisam and the organization for the invitation, which allowed me to come back to the settimana and the time. Also in the past, I dealt with it, but now we'll talk about time, rhythms, and the monks. In the prologue to the first book of his dialogues, Gregory the Great complains to Petrus, his interlocutor, about how hard it is for him to cope with the mundane affairs required by his pastoral duties. And so he was forced to a heavy condescendence towards the crowd, and reflecting on what he has to endure, he regrets what he has left behind and lost. My unhappy soul, all engrossed and surely troubled by its occupations, remembers what I was once in the monastery, when all that flows away was beneath it, and it overlooked all that is mobile and passing, for it meditated on nothing but the things of heaven. This evocation of the years spent in the monastery that Gregory had founded on Mount Celion could summarize in some ways an image however idealized, of what the Christian who embraced monastic life expected: an anticipated entry into God's company, an overcoming of earthly time, of the saeculum, on the verge of dissolving in an anticipated way into eternitas, the known time that implied becoming part of celestial joy. A timeless life in paradise as a reward for holy sacrifices. The text, in its apparent geographic linearity, appears as a compendium of the final aspirations of the monastic profession, which can be summed up in salvation. A salvation that, as Euchre of Lyon wants, the monastery and the desert in some way anticipate. Great indeed is the grace of the place, if the hermitage is already in its life such man as the happiness of the blessed life will have them. The hermit, like the monk in his community, at the moment of separating himself from the world, separates himself not only in the sense of physical space, but also worldly time, proper to men who live without having eternity as a perspective. A little further on, Eucharist expounds more precisely on the longing of the professed. Day and night they compete in strenuous vigils to learn the beginning of that life whose end shall not be found, and by these means they obtain that for those for whom the end of time has come, times without end are reserved. These passages from Euchre and Gregory the Great introduce us to the theme of our investigation, the conception of time in the context of monastic life, but not in all its facets. What is proposed here is the yearning for eschatological time, where everything that is not in contact with God remains excluded. A dimension of time proper in various ways to the ideal and behavior of the ascetics of the Thebaid. However, this is not an ascetic improvisation. In the opposition secolorum fines decurrerunt, bis saecula sine fine contingent, that has just been noted, the whole problematic of the Christian conception of time is implicit, where lived time clearly differs from eternity. Defining such a Christian conception of time is not by any means simple. In a generic way, the most obvious contrast with the thought of the classics lies in the fact that in the face of an essentially cyclical perception, a linear conception of time is proposed, a time that is continuous, progressive, irreversible, and a manifestation of God's will. A theology of the time that placed man, essentially his soul, in God's economy, in his plans for his redemption. It results salvation that the monk aspires to achieve through his profession. Mystical time and historical time thus overlap in the Christian reformulation of the calendar, a Christian calendar that from the 4th century was ordered around a series of festivals that sacralized the passage of time in parallel with the celebration proper to the pagan tradition. If current time, everyday life, and in the case of the Christian community, even liturgical time, were already defined when spontaneous asceticism was organized in cenobitic form, we must ask ourselves what the monastery added to the already established Christian conception of time. Essentially, in adaptation to the ascetic aims of the Cenobites, a meticulous regulation of prayer, reading, sleep, and vigil, meals and fasts, work. Everything is subordinated to a written norm, to the rule, and to the authority of the superior, in such a way as to completely override the will of the individual. To understand the truly innovative significance of time in the monastery, we must take into account that it cannot be analyzed as a mere ordering of activities subject to a routine, lighter or stricter as the case may be. Monastic time is an inseparable part of the new community that is the monastery. a new city, even a temple in the form of the city, according to two expressions I take from Alba Maria Orselli. An Augustinian evocation clearly defines the time of the monastery as the time of salvation, a time ordered for salvation. At the end of the 7th century, Valerio del Bierzo, an ascetic from Galizia, recounts the mental process that will lead him to the monastery. In the midst of the darkness of the devious world, all of a sudden, touched by the desire for divine grace, thinking that my salvation lay in the refuge of the cenobio of Compludo, inflamed by enthusiasm of an infinite desire and terrified by the future judgment, I finally, through a path of conversion, thought I had reached the light of truth. At the end of his life, in one of his last writings, he offers a description of what tools the monk has at his disposal to achieve his goals. And we think he will reach the eternity. The courage of our labors, our vigils, our fasts and unceasing prayers, and the various exercises of divine service that the rule imposes. So the short passage summarizes the daily pattern governing monastic life, and above all, the importance of the rule as a guide to the monk's existence. Submission to the monastic rule entailed a number of practical advantages. The most obvious is that the professed do not have to establish his own path to salvation, for he found the road to paradise marked out by the monastic rule. Aurelian of Arles, around the middle of the 6th century, proclaims in the prologue of his rule for monks, "We have established for you a rule and a norm of discipline that will enable you to proceed righteously along the path of perfection and aptly gain the kingdom of heaven." The professed accept the condition of life imposed in the community enters. From now on, it will be a vita regularis.
È sostituita dalla rinuncia alla propria volontà.
And renounces to once we reduce the subordination to the authority of the monastery and its superiors, which presupposes a global process of resocialization. This factor, obedience, denial of one's will, is essential to understanding life in the monastery and the monk's very conception of time. The aim of the monastic custom rites consists in mortifying and crucifying one's own will, and consistent with the evangelical precept not to think about tomorrow. Those cenobites would devise an almost perfect organization when it comes to establishing daily activities and regulating their rhythm in a hitherto unknown way, start from an essential premise. The individual monk has no control over his life, over his personal time. In a chapter devoted to assessing what should be the attitude towards poverty or abundance, Leander of Seville rhetorically asks his sister, who lives in a monastery, "How does this concern you if you already have a rule to follow? Virtue, which is the path to approach God, demands perfection, and this can only be achieved through self-denial. This denial of the self plays a central role in all the monastic rules that circulated in the West from the 4th to the 9th century. The first step of monastic asceticism consists in the renunciation of the world. This, for the professed, involves two stages. One, obviously of a mental character, implies an absolute reorientation of all these emotional attachments. The other, of a practical character, the renunciation to wealth, comfort, and formerly all his possessions. The monk is poor, and poverty conditions obedience. Once monks, novices find themselves totally at the mercy of monasteries to survive. Moreover, the monk, thus confined within the monastery, isolates himself from the outside world. In a generic way, any private time is renounced. As said, obedience constitutes the first virtue. To act freely, to exercise one's own will, constitutes the essential root of sin. Obedience frees one from all danger. The Regula Communis would specify at the end of the 7th century, monks submit to the abbot unconditionally. Not only do they not have to worry about their temporal needs and to reclaim their souls, it's the one who carried out these orders that should provide the inspiration, and not those who obeyed to this order, this being good or bad. This chapter of the Regula Magistri represents one of the most frequently discussed topics on the value of monastic obedience for the attainment of salvation. Obedience forms the basis of all the other virtues. Obedience to God and to death is represented by obedience to the superior and the rule of life, as Virtuoso of Braga prescribes even in impossible things. Obedience, humility, submission, total renunciation of the will demand a degree of self-discipline that the lawgivers recognize as difficult for most professed monks to achieve. The monk must orally confess to the abbot all bad thoughts and any sins committed secretly. This confession formed part of the program of denial of individuality required by a cenobitic life. As part of this system of control, all the monks' activities are subject to strict supervision. Continuous advice easily turns into admonitions and prohibitions. The aforementioned rule of Frutuoso, for example, states that without the permission of the superior, monks shall not pull a thorn, no one shall cut their nails, one shall throw any tusk behind them. The mistakes committed by the monks result in a whole penal system, a penitentiary regime that reaches high levels of elaboration. The rules emphasize how reality was more stubborn than the provisions intended to nullify the monks' forms of protest. Idleness and freedom of decision of the monks, but there is no doubt that the monk, enclosed in a cloister that pretends to ignore the external world, the saeculum, lives subject to a constant limitation of individuality for the benefit of collectivity on the fringe of social changes, of conflictual contexts on the fringe of world time. The monk can do nothing according to his own will. Everything is established by the rule and directed by the abbot or his delegates. Life of the monks is governed by a principle that seems to have been collected in the sentences of Sextus all the time. You do not devote to thinking about God, consider it time wasted. Without forgetting the remaining rules available to us, the rule of the master, the Regula Magistri and Regula Benedicti, because of the systematic nature of the regulations, are a good guide to the monastery's time. To understand the monastery's time, their detailed orders allow us to understand the monastery as an organism, in a biological sense, of a hierarchical social community where its members are not conceived separately. A comparison is only partially literary. Aurelian, as I said, writes that following the call to abandon a job, the monks will turn to the next activity as fast as cunning bees when they fly around the hive. The first aspect worth highlighting in order to understand monastery time consists in the apparent contradiction between a place that claims to be an antechamber to eternity, beyond the passing of time, and the obsessive limitation of the times and rhythms of each event. Nothing in monastery life is left to chance. If we take up the Christian conception of time with which we began this report, we find it fully embedded in the monasteries, even if followed and summed up differently. These times are, on the other hand, asymmetrical. They are so according to the seasons into which the year is divided. This morning we've been talking about this, winter and summer, which the regular magistry distinguishes by means of a fixed date, the winter equinox, 24th September, and the moving date, Easter. Winter and summer imply another asymmetry, represented by the different duration of the hours. At any given time, the duration of the day and the night is 12 hours, and this implies that only on the dates of the equinoxes will the 24 intervals of the day be of the same duration, whereas on the occasion of the solstices, the duration of the day and night hours would result in a maximum imbalance. There is no doubt that the circumstance ends up influencing every daily activity, so much that we will see how the homogeneous character of the routine involves multiple corrective elements in order to mitigate the distinct light-darkness requirements. Occasionally, they define the regulations for the parallel cases related to cold, heat conditions, work and food. The date of Easter is crucial because it coincides with the change of the season and the liturgical cycle. Around Easter revolves the entire liturgy of the Christian, the Feast of Salvation and the beginning of the New Year. Coinciding with it is the culmination of Lent, a preparatory cycle that begins 6 weeks before Easter, and it is in fact already underway during Epiphany, which in turn closes the cycle of the Nativity, as does the 100th Pascha that culminates in Pentecost. Each of these periods brings some variation to the cycles of prayer, vigil, or fasting. In each season, a shorter cycle is imposed, which sometimes constitutes to a greater extent the daily routine, the week. It is this shorter cycle that best shapes the time of liturgy, prayers, reading, sleep, fasting, and work. In this case, the fundamental day is Sunday. With all this, the true chronometer of the monk's life is the liturgy of the hours. It is this that marks the most important moments of the day and night. There is no doubt that the task of the Christian, and certainly of the monk, is to pray without ceasing. But collective prayer must be regulated. The main hours relate to moments in the life of Jesus and the apostles. They are fractions of a sacred time that imply a constant flow between an immediate temporality and a mystical supratemporality. The liturgy of the hours was not exclusively monastic, but in a monastery it acquired an absolutely indispensable modulating character. It is first and foremost in the fulfillment of the divine office, as the Master wrote, that is morning, first, third, sixth, ninth, vespers, and complete. Numerous chapters devoted to defining the entire cycle of prayers testify to a repetitive process designed so that, in praising God, it also serves to immerse the monk in a state of absolute renunciation, of individual introspection. Implicit in its detailed planning and execution is a rhythm that undoubtedly represents a measure of time, especially useful when, in the absence of the solar course, a clock or a regular cadence is required. Psalms, responsories, antiphons, and readings adhere to a strict meter. However, while in the daily services there are no variations, the nocturnal services are longer than in summer. However, if the rhythm of the chants and recitations served to mark the duration of the monastic service and the time when it had to end. The problem, especially during the night, is how to fix the start time. Before the invention of the mechanical clock, the only natural alarm clock was the chanting of the cockerel. The celebration of Eve services is associated with the chant of the rooster. But if we take into account the fact that the Octava Ora Noctis, to which Benedict alluded, fell around 2:30 in the night, it is difficult to relate it to the chant that precedes the rising of the sun and will mark the beginning of the day. The fact that there is an occasional mention of more than a cockcrow, including a quartum gallorum cantum, prevents us from being able to specify more precisely to what extent the cockcrow announced the dawn. Cassian specifies that a brother must take charge of controlling the time of rising, and he must not do so in a vain manner, guided by imagination or according to the whim of his sleep or insomnia. However experienced he may be in waking up, he must pay attention to stellarum cursu without committing imprudence to ensure the tranquility of his brothers. In Regula Magistri, this function does not seem to be very well defined. In one case, an index nomen accipit is alluded to, who calls the brothers to psalmody, but it seems that this task was delegated to the provosts, who usually delegate to two particularly solicitous brothers. Those who have the task of waking during the week, let them be careful to check their watches day and night, and remind everyone, abbot and brothers, of the hour of psalmody. The reason for entrusting two people with the task of waking is so that they can alternately watch over. The rule in their honor coined the appellation of Vigigallos. The Regula Fructuosi alluded to Vigilaris Fratribus, in a similar meaning. In the case of Benedict's rule, the call to the divine office corresponds to the abbot, without giving more precise details about precautions taken to ensure its completion. However, while Cassian specified that the vigilante should pay attention to the stars, the master's rule states that vigilantes day and night should carefully check the watch. As to what instrument this Orelegium was, few options remain that would allow for day and night consultation. On a later occasion, the master alludes to the difficulties that in the cloudy days when the sun hides its ray to the world, that they were in the monastery traveling or in the field, they would spend this time Sirit Umbra, so the sun disappeared and the watch would be blind. So in this way we can imagine a solar quadrant thinking at a portable instrument, as we said this morning. An instrument that is so fully described in the work of Isidoro de Sevilla is to be discarded as regards the night. In identifying a unique instrument that could be used day and night, a computational table was proposed that would function according to the position of the stars and the sun, but we do not have indications of these instruments up to the 9th century as we have seen today. In some cases, it's probable that the daily practice allowed to follow a more or less regular rhythm, even though it was not always simple to anticipate the 9th up to the half of the 8th hour, as St. Benedict's rule foresees for the summer days, without counting on any instrument that would allow such a precision, visual precision. If the canonical hours with the expected prayers and psalmody regulated the daily rhythm, time involved other important moments, or the day involved other important moments. The regulation of sleep, meals, and certainly work contributed to the scanning of a time where moments of otium were practically absent. It was customary to devote the time not occupied by scheduled activities to reading and mediating on texts as an end, and since the struggle for purity meant that the mind was constantly immersed in the things of God. The rest mentioned in the rules is not so much a time of rest, rather a compensation for the few hours of sleep in the summer and the need to rest from the hard work of the season. It is difficult to establish how much sleep the monks actually got, which on the other hand could vary quite a bit depending on the rules and certainly on the time of year. According to calculations made on the basis of the Regula Benedicti, it is considered that it could fluctuate between almost 10 hours in the longest nights of winter and about 5.5 hours on the shortest nights of summer, and that they were compensated with rest. Night, I have to say, occupies a negative place in the imagination of those who, fearful of evil, associate darkness with the siege of the evil one, who takes advantage of his weakness to tempt his soul. At night, the pure-hearted monk can meditate, and the possibilities of control seem to escape the designs of one's will, as St. Basil reminded us. One solution may be for the monk to go to bed tired, to sleepwalk, or to be woken when sleep is not yet over, as Columbanus wanted. An idea that also seems to depart from the nocturnal schedule of prayers in the Regula Fructuosi, which mentions omnibus nocturnis orationibus. In fact, one has the feeling that sleep was an exception, made up of short periods, so discontinuous as to break any sequence in natural biological rhythms. The Regula Benedicti and the Regula Magistri are not involved in these extreme cases of sleep deprivation on which they barely theorize, limiting themselves to regulating decorum and order in the dormitories, although they do not go to the extreme of Edelmano of Corbie, who in the mid-9th century, in his commentary on the Regula Benedicti, considers that a monk may not sin during sleep. Diet, both with regard to content and quantity, occupies an important place in practically all the rules, which is understandable since a lack of control in eating easily leads to a fall into gluttony. And he who represses the passion for gluttony undoubtedly dominates the movements of lasciviousness, written by Isidore of Sibi in his Regula. Sobriety in eating is therefore a virtue. Perhaps this is why eating time does not appear to be a time that marks the day in itself. In practice, it represents an interruption in daily life, albeit a deeply sacred one, because of the significance of food in itself as a gift from God. Lunch usually takes place at 6 or 9 o'clock, that is either at noon or around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, although the time may vary according to the season or day, as well as age and health. Although the monastic ideal is a single lunch, some rules envisage dividing the meal into 2 parts of the day. The meal involves ritual and the time, a ritual of silence, isolation, blessings. It's also an occasion for meditation. In any case, it is accompanied by readings that feed the spirit and usually begins with some prayer, a psalm, and always ends with thanksgiving. Time would be estimated in the same way. The meal, because of its very routine character, was not a time of distraction. It is not possible to specify the exact duration nor whether it was always celebrated before or after the prayer of the corresponding hour. The evidence is imprecise and seems to vary according to the rules. Work and reading also constitute important elements in the temporal definition of the monk's day. Their association already appears in St. Augustine's Ordo Monasteri, while at the beginning of the 5th century, Cassian devotes special attention to this relationship. In the latter case, the stance in favor of work corroborates both its usefulness for the monk's survival and as an antidote against the snares of the evil one. Arguments used in the monastic literature in an almost generalized manner. By the struggle of works, one expels vices. Isidore says, in any case, the defense of work could be based on a multitude of scriptural quotations, no doubt more numerous than those concerning reading, which is an essentially monastic innovation. The Regula Benedicti, immediately following its well-known harangue on idleness as the enemy of the soul, states in a detailed way the succession of both occupations during the day, not neglecting the variability that the seasons of the year require, as we have seen for other activities. Most rules account for the same dual pattern, and variations are not significant. When these do appear with regard to time or intensity, they be motivated, as in other respects, either by the whim, so to say, of the legislator, or more likely by local traditions, the extemporaneous needs or the concrete needs of each monastery. Saint Benedict's rule alludes to particular conditions of poverty that could result in monks being obliged to unaccustomed tasks. This is the case with harvesting. In other rules, there is a sense that such agricultural work was predominant and common daily. Let us leave aside the details to the printed version. However, beyond the rational order of the time, some rules, that of Isidore of Seville is in a sense particularly significant, can be read as a manual for the good management on agricultural estate. In contrast to the image of a provost concerned almost exclusively with the coexistence of the monks, Isidore lists a whole series of activities whose spiritual imprint is not evident. The management of affairs, the administration of farms, the sowing of land, the planting and care of vineyards, the care of livestock, and so on. These are just a few examples of the detailed catalogue of activities and crafts in short reflection of an entire production system. However, and this is of great importance, it is not a mere question of hours and time, but rather of an enormous deployment of coordinated activities that demanded meticulous control in planning and forecasting, something apparently incompatible with the idea, which we have seen expressed by Cassian, according to which the Cenobitic did not have to think about tomorrow. The metaphor of the monastery as a narrow path leading to salvation appears frequently in monastic literature, always in connection with the ideas of self-denial and absolute obedience on the part of the professed. The monastery is seen as a brief period of suffering, breves angustias, which entails as a reward aeterna premia. It has been noted how this negation implies the renunciation of any decision-making, personal control of any fraction of time. It has been likewise how this idealized image of the monastery as an anticipation of paradise is part of an entirely ideological assumption.
Life in a monastery passes inexorably The monks are not indifferent to the passing of time, and the rules make this clear every time. Generations of monks succeed one another. Life in the monastery is a process of intellectual and spiritual formation. Legislators contemplate different disciplines according to age. Saint Benedict emphasizes that every age and every intelligence must be treated appropriately, especially careful with children and adolescents. Probably in no late antique or early medieval document can the human passage of time be contemplated as obsessively as in the monastic rules. One factor that reinforces this idea is the focus on punctuality. Nothing must begin or end out of time, neither prayer nor meal, not even sleep. Work may be an exception because its demands are sometimes less predictable. Virtually every rule devotes a section to dealing with the punishments provided for those who are late for prayer or for meals, establishing exactly when they are considered late, and setting out the punishments that apply to such delay, pointing out whether it is greater or lesser, whether due to accident, laziness, or habit. On all occasions, the penalties involve reprimands and humiliation. Punctuality is established through a system of measurements, and it has been mentioned how, as far as we know, this was necessarily imperfect. However, more important than the exact precision in relation to the movement of the stars is the fiction of exactitude marked by the punctuality just mentioned. Every prayer, the meeting of the monks' confereta, the mass, the beginning of the vigil, the meal, and all the activities carried out in the monastery is preceded by a call or an announcement. The Regula Benedicti alludes to the nuncio when it comes to who is responsible for the communication of the services. The master calls index bihu with sonus suocus to the psalmody. In both cases, it refers to the one who warns who calls. Moxa audium fuerit signum is an expression that immediately relates us to a signal that indicated the need to get moving. A call that, to be consistent with what has been said, had to be sonorous. A signal that, according to the Oriental rule, would not be given by a voice, by a word, and at least in some cases would be repeated twice. At the first time, one would leave the task to be available when the second chime sounded. This double call could be used for the beginning of any task. It is likely that the calls were distinct according to the importance of what was being called for. We cannot consider the signo dato vel nudibus with which the Phrygian abbot calls the attention of the servant of the table, with which and the signo universali with which the same rule defines the signal for a general change of activity to be equivalent. One should not rule out the possibility that the signal was given by means of a wind instrument, more likely by means of a bell, the use of which would become common in the medieval world. Regula Pauli et Stephani alludes to a wooden instrument, and Eugipio alludes to a percussion instrument, possibly in the shape of the simander, common in Eastern monasticism. In any case, we must think of any object capable of emitting a clear and sufficiently audible sound, suitable for distinct calls, even in some way modulable. It might also be that distinct instruments were used, depending on the occasion. Having reached this final point, it is clear that the idea of the monastery as a timeless antechamber to eternity is not consistent with the meticulous organization of its rhythms. It is possible that keeping one's mind busy thinking about God was a means of distancing oneself from the world, its material woes and passions, Yet the narrow path that the monastery claims to be forms its harmony through order, through repetition in cycles of different lengths, interspersed cycles that demanded counting and measuring. From the ages that encompassed the times foreseen by the Creator in view of his final judgment, to the fundamental celebration of Easter, the preparatory periods, the week as a serial cycle, and the day with their essential units, the hours, not forgetting that they had to organize their property, anticipate and calculate the needs for their mere survival, plan their harvests and harvest planning, the baking of bread and the production of wine, occasionally cider, along with wheat, barley, and vegetables, omnipresent in the rules. The discipline of coexistence and the planning of the economy were converted into a calendar full of celebration, anniversary, and to the most meticulous extent attained in the early Middle Age. It was not by chance that the mechanical clock was invented in the monastery. It was a logical consequence of the anxiety to appropriate earthly time with a conviction of securing eternity in this way. Thank you.
Professore, grazie. Mentre lei
Thank you, Professor. While you were tracing this new frame, I was thinking of the books by Léon Blanc on this world. And when the discussion time comes, I will ask a few questions to you.
La seconda lettura.
So, shall I read the other communications now? Okay. So, communication for the speakers. We must always obey when someone tells you to do something. So, communication for the speakers. We are kindly requested to communicate the Secretariat your participation in the Bevagna trip of Sunday afternoon, 16th of April, as provided for by the agenda of the settimana.
The Secretariat of your participation in the Bevagna trip on Sunday afternoon, 16 April, as scheduled in the program of the conference. Thank you. Altra serie sta qui. Si rende noto che le lezioni.
We inform you that the lectures of tomorrow will start at 9:45 with the following schedule. 9:45 lecture by Bartolomei, 10:45 Montanari.
Note that lectures of Saturday, 15 April, will begin at 9:45 ante meridiem, with the following scheduled: 9:45 ante meridiem, Bartolomei lecture. 10:45 ante meridiem, Montanari lecture. Io ho letto tutto.
So I read everything. Now we can have the discussion following the order of the lectures. So the first lecture by Professor Tino LICHT, who illuminated us with this lecture. So if you have questions, remarks, don't hesitate. Thank you, Dino, for this wonderful presentation. I have a question on Gerbert's interest towards Boetius. In your opinion, based on your studies, it is a question, it is a matter of scientific, historical interest. Was he interested in the contents of the text? Maybe so his profile reflected in Boetius' life as a consultant of the emperor. Maybe he developed his interest towards this person, historian. Well, what I can say is that the interest towards Boetius comes before the meeting with Otto, and so consequently this might have been the first reason. Of course, it is a scientific interest. But if we go back to Gerbert's studies, yes, somewhere in northwestern Spain, there seems to be an interest in arithmetics in previous phases, but you know this also. So we have the first testimonies of Arab figures, and this is evidence we cannot classify. I mean, there's no zero, so it is not easy to make calculations, but I believe that the scientific interest towards numbers was there. We do not know when he developed it, maybe already in Aurillac in some early phases of his life, in the contacts he had. There was something which fascinated him for sure. So please be quick because it's very cold here on the stage. So we need to warm up the environment. No further questions for Professor Licht. So now let's discuss the second lecture by Professor Enrico Acerbi.
A very short question for you. I mean, as you rightly pointed out, the beauty of those computistical texts is that you can date them fairly precisely, which obviously makes us potentially reflect on why they were written in the years that they were written. Did you see in the text that you analyzed any potential patterns of the dates of composition? So when I looked at your dates, one thing that was striking, at least for the years I remember from the Carolingian period, that 780, 811, 840, they are all years of solar eclipses. So I wonder whether you could see patterns why people composed texts about the reckoning of time in the years they did, and things like celestial phenomena could be a potential trigger.
In my database, it's quite random, but it depends on the period. In the 14th century, there is almost one dated computus every year. So, before, thank you for suggesting. I shall try to do some correlation, but you know that it's like medicine. Correlations can be established between anything and anything. So, maybe yes, maybe not.
Can I follow that up with a more technical question in that sense? The other thing that was striking that you showed was the difference in manuscripts, in the quality of the manuscripts. So what we have actually, and especially in the tables, what we usually have in the Latin tradition is actually the more beautifully decorated a table is, the less accurate it is, because the purpose is different. It's a display purpose rather than, do you see something similar there that you mentioned it, I think, for one of those tables, that it had a low accuracy or more mistakes than another one, and the one with more mistakes looked very lavish and strong decoration. Can you see the purpose in the number of mistakes and in the quality of
yes.
the tables?
Usually, you see, the one in which there is almost a mess is the most beautiful manuscript of the handy table. So that is the Florence handy tables. And this was definitely a professional copyist. It is also true that for early manuscripts, non-professional copies are not so frequent. In later periods, okay, if it is badly written, usually it is someone who was interested in the contents, and he was also, maybe he was also able to check something. A professional copyist can do a mess out of everything. And in the case of tables, this is even more frequent than in the case of text. It is also true that tables, your copies tend to do a conformal copy, okay? But there are patterns that are a bit tricky. If you do not understand that there is a pattern,
Roberto, una curiosità che...
A curiosity for Mr. ACERBI. So I have this thought. The dates of the events, celebrations in a society in which there is or there should be a distinction between civil, lay field, and religious field. We have civil celebrations and ecclesiastical celebrations. In an environment like the Byzantine world, is there the sense, the perception, or the problem concerning this distinction? I don't know whether I was clear, because it's true. It's the same dessert are eaten by the believers, non-believers, but then there are other problems. This is a nice question for a historian. My impression in the text that I studied, that everything is calibrated on the secret in centuries in which there are efforts from authors. These people are there again. Other questions? Otherwise, we can now discuss the very rich lecture by Professor DÍAZ, where you talk about this world. I'm sorry, he doesn't speak on the microphone. So I was thinking of the volumes by Leon, a very lay thinker, and a very famous publication by Claudio Leonardi, Catholic, entitled End of Monasticism. There was a short publication by Leonardi, which has a great meaning in this issue, in this change of times in which we live today, which are granted to us. Rather than a historical question, is a question of thoughts. Sometimes I read some memoirs, also some contemporary monks who tell you why they went to the monastery. And usually they, just like this text by Letter the First, So the monk, for the monk, entering the monastery is entering a dimension with no time, timeless monastery. So this was so the obsession was to reject the idea of the passage of time, and he had the thought that going to the monastery meant ending this obsession for death. But then he told me that it was awful because at the time he had a lot of time to think, and he had more problems than before. So the monk, pious monk, wants to enter the monastery, but in the monastery all minutes are set, and so the monk finds temporal blocks, time orders in a place where the supreme dimension should be the eternal dimension. But they know they have to wake up at 3 at night, etc. So everything is somehow connected in diversity. I hope I'm not wrong. Professor Franceschini, great historian, scholar of some authors, monks, priesthood monks, said he left the world to find silence, and he feels silence with their chats. By writing. So there is a contradiction, which is a contradiction of things. So there's nothing to be worried, there's nothing to be scandalized or surprised, because it is difficult to compose time in eternal dimension. More than once in my lecture, which is also a summary of the text, I tried more than once to mark this contradiction. Gregory the Great is an example, and also Eucharius, he wrote it, living this time to start a timeless life. But the contradiction is that monastic life is the most regulated one, even more than the military life, especially in late antiquity, late Middle Age, and especially in this case. It's true that rules are very different. We have situations where rules are impossible to follow, and others which are less strict. The Irish monasticism, yeah. But anyway, times change, I don't know. Do we have questions for Professor Díaz? If there are no questions, we can stop for now, and I won't repeat the communications for tomorrow because you already know everything. Thank you. Enjoy your evening.
Grazie, un po' freddo. Voi siete...